Welcome back. Abortion remains the defining issue on the ballot in Florida this November. Amendment 4 would guarantee a woman's right to have an abortion up to the moment of viability, which is about 24 weeks. In other words, it would take Florida back to what we had during Roe versus Wade. But Governor Ron DeSantis is doing everything he can to fight the amendment and is using some bureaucratic tricks to try to confuse voters. I spoke to Democratic State Senator Lauren Book about what the governor is up to.
This last Monday, the Florida Estimating Conference met to agree to some language that surrounds the Amendment 4 ballot initiative. It does this with all ballot initiatives, and it talks about the fiscal impact of this amendment passing, should it pass, on the state. It is done all the time. It is done every time initiatives come on the ballot. It will come along with some of that ballot language that is our language that came before the Supreme Court. This time, however, it was a very interesting hearing. It was an 8-hour hearing where you really got some interesting arguments around the fiscal impact of this amendment passing. What's important to note, and red flags should be all over the place for everyone. Amy Baker, who you have paid attention to, we have paid attention to at the legislature for many, many, many years, under many different administrations, Republicans, mostly for the last decades of time, right? Said she wouldn't sign this statement that came from the estimating conference that was put together this week because she thought it was too far afield and too political, really, to go along with this ballot initiative. They made 3 arguments. The governor's office made 3 arguments that we can kind of go through. But real red flags should be going up about that statement and where we're going.
So let me just jump in here. So essentially this is language that the voter will see when they go into the voting booth that suggests that if they pass Amendment 4, there could be severe, dire economic consequences to doing this. And this is the language that's being put on there by the Revenue Estimating Committee, a committee that nobody has ever heard of. Now, let's just talk about the committee for a second. Who appoints the members on that committee?
Well, there's one from the House, one from the Senate. There's Amy Baker, the chief economist in our state, and then somebody who is from the governor's office. In this case, Chris Spencer, who I happen to have a tremendous amount of respect for, worked in the Senate with colleagues of ours. And I think that he does a great job. But in this case, I don't agree with the position of the governor's office and the arguments that they were making. And I think it's quite dangerous when they are using their political thumb and weight on something that isn't political. And why I applaud Amy Baker, our chief economist in the state, for not signing this statement, because it is too far afield.
It essentially argues that because if the amendment passes, there may be litigation, there's no way to tell how expensive that litigation is going to be. And by the way, there's litigation surrounding every amendment because it's always about how you then implement the amendment, how you move forward with it. Has language like this ever been tacked on to any amendment before?
No, and quite frankly, we're used to this in the legislature. You put a high fiscal impact or an indeterminate fiscal statement when there's a bill that comes out that they don't like, or you see that quite a bit. And actually, they made 3 arguments. One is that litigation costs that you mentioned, Jim, and that's true. Litigation comes with everything. Quite frankly, if Amendment 4 passed, that would really decrease the amount of litigation that comes, because it's just restoring the law of the land that has existed in Florida for 50 plus years. It should really decrease some of that litigation. But let's also be really honest here. The governor's office and the governor had never shied away from litigation costs. Just ask the migrants he sent to Martha's Vineyard, quite frankly. And every year within the budget, we set aside millions and millions of dollars for litigation. They also made the argument that could or should in some time from now somebody challenge the law and sue to have Medicaid cover abortions, that we would have to cover the cost of abortions, that Medicaid would somehow have to cover the cost of abortion. That has never happened. That's not the case before, not the case now. That is a huge far afield argument that was made on top of another argument that is lost revenue, that the population growth would slow so much that it would have a severe fiscal impact on local and state governments.
Wait a second, the population growth would slow because of all the abortions?
Correct. That was the argument that was made.
Wait a second. So many babies would be killed, in other words, so many fetuses would die that the state's population would be severely impacted and therefore would cost the state money at some indeterminate time in the future. That's the argument?
That is correct. Those were the three arguments that were made by the governor's office. And again, when you think about the ridiculousness of that, it is over the top. As the former chair of Children and Family Services, I can tell you we have a system that is already severely overburdened. Even if you went down the path of that argument, let's go down that path for a second. An abortion is a one-time, very small cost compared to relative to a lifetime of services that would be in need here. And they outlined that and they talked through some of that. Department of Justice, Children and Families, the Department of Health, Department of Education. I mean, we really need to think about the totality and the ridiculousness and somersaults that went into something that you point out at the very beginning of our conversation here, something that is in the basement of the Capitol that nobody ever covers or nobody ever talks about. This was a very thumb heavy governor's office presence on something that shouldn't be. The proponents of Amendment 4 did challenge the statement in court on Wednesday. That was overturned Wednesday morning, I believe. And so we'll see where this goes. But again, I think that our chief economist not signing off on this language and this statement really does tell us where we should and what we should be looking at.
I noticed that the governor continues to spew misinformation about the intentions of the ballot by repeatedly going public and saying if this amendment passes, it would allow abortions even after the child is born, right up to the moment of birth and the seconds thereafter. That is not true, right?
It has never happened, was never the law of the land, was never a case. It has never happened. It does not happen. That is not reality. And so you can't have these conversations about things that could potentially happen in a world that is not the case. But let's talk about some real things, real facts. Women having access to reproductive health and freedom has allowed women to achieve higher levels of education, great jobs, and that is a true economic reality. When we talk about the true economic reality, we're going back to what this is really supposed to be about. This is about freedom. This is about women having a right to choose what happens to their body, regardless of what this fiscal impact statement says. I know and I believe that people across the state of Florida, we have met Republicans, independents, and Democrats alike, want to give women the right to choose what happens to their body, the medical freedom to decide what happens to them. It has been stripped from them. I have heard some terrible stories. You and I have talked about some of the very scary realities that have existed now for women under this 6-week ban. I believe and I know that as we get closer to November, we're going to hear from some of those women and some of the stories that have come out since this terrible ban has come into play. And people across the state of Florida are going to make sure that women have a right to choose what happens to their bodies come November.
This really doesn't need to be a partisan issue, does it?
It's really not. I have talked to Republican women, men across the state of Florida. These are MAGA Trumpsters. I have supporters of Governor DeSantis who are going to vote yes on Amendment 4 because they believe that women have the right to choose what happens to their bodies. I have Republican voters that are no on 3 and yes on 4. We have validators that are going to come out and speak to those voters individually because we know that across the board, people believe that the legislature has gone far too far in taking away a woman's right to decide what happens to their body. Again, You look at it in terms of wanted, anticipated pregnancies. What has this done? This has put women in harm's way in countless ways. But I'll go back to things that you and I have talked about. There are women that are being sent to sit in their cars to develop sepsis-like symptoms before they can get appropriate health care to get a DNC or an abortion because their pregnancy is no longer viable past 6 weeks in a day. This is insanity. This is third world. We live in the greatest state that I believe in the country, and women are being treated like less than. And I can't even imagine that we're in the state that we're in, but we are, and we're all going to fight very hard to make sure that come November, that is not the reality for women throughout the state of Florida.
We'll be right back.